I'll lose them too.
Yes.
Okay, big meeting room, we can't hear you.
Looks like
Yeah,
you're
I think
muted
you guys
there. Yeah.
muted. Yep.
Yeah, it went on then off.
Also, I'm here. I don't know if you can hear me, but I don't have camera visibility, I don't think.
We can hear you, Melissa.
Okay, well, I'm here. You don't have to see me.
I can see your raised hand though.
Okay, well, I'll lower that.
Can you hear us now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Good.
Guys, we have a full house. Ashton, thanks for chairing last time. You did a spectacular job.
Oh, my pleasure.
I have considered not coming tonight and just saying do it again. Amazing. Well, sorry to miss last time. I very much enjoyed listening to the recording, and it was a very dense meeting. So thanks for all the work you put into it. Okay, let's officially call our meeting to order. And gosh, yeah, let's see. How do we do this? Anybody want to read the land acknowledgement? Looks like this is the crickets that you got last time, Ashton. Also, I can't remember where we were with this, if we need to have it as an agenda item, or was it resolved that it's fine the way it stands?
I think we agreed to have it as an agenda item.
In the future.
At some point. Yeah.
All right. Meredith, sorry. Okay.
We'd like to acknowledge we are on the traditional land of a rich and diverse group of Native peoples who have called this area home for more than 10,000 years. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the descendants of these Native peoples who are still here today. In doing this, we aim to illuminate the longer history of this land we call home, our relationship to this history, and the heritage of those peoples whose ancestors lived here before the European American immigration that began in the 1800s.
Thanks a lot, Meredith. I still remain that there's something that's really amazing to me about being able to carry the baton right now as a planning commission for stewardship for this land that's been so well cared for so long. Okay, approval of the agenda. Can I get a motion to bring the agenda to the table?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Thanks, Stephen. Is there anything else that you feel urgently needs to be added to the agenda or deleted from the agenda before we get started? No? All those in favor of the agenda as published, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Hi.
Aye.
Thank you. Sorry,
Aye.
waited for everyone. Not trying to hurry us or anything. Okay, what about the meeting minutes? Did everyone have a chance to review them before? Okay, great. Could I get a motion to bring them forward for approval?
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Thanks, Sam. Did anybody have any amendments to anything glaring from the minutes that we should discuss, or can we approve them? All right, seeing none, all those in favor of adopting the meeting minutes as published, please say aye.
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 Opposed? Excellent. All right, next meeting date. Are we meeting still in December? Is anybody traveling in December in a way that will stop you from being here?
What's the date?
Well,
Yes, I will be traveling.
okay, will you be joining us remotely, or
Probably not.
everybody online? Will you be able to make the 12th? Terrific.
Yes.
Okay, I think particularly with Christina doing so much work and her colleagues, we really want to be sure to try to protect these meeting times as much as we can. Okay, well then, let's see, any citizen comments? Come on over, Sarah. You can just come be my buddy right here. Then you'll be close to the microphone. Do you want to sit here?
No. Hi, my name is Sarah Phillips. I'm with the Climate Action Committee. And I'm here sort of two hats on. The first is the Climate Action Committee to tell you to listen into what you guys are doing and sort of how that integrates into what we're doing. And a lot of what we're doing is saying, and the comprehensive plan will take care of this. So just so that's an important thing. We're working on finalizing our document. We hope to have it done by, we hope to actually bring it to council in January, second meeting in January, but we've had that wish before. So, well, we're working. The other thing I want to take off that hat and put on another hat, and I just wanted to share with you a project that I've been working on called the Milwaukee Forest Project. And this is a dense urban forest, and it's going to be in Shoreline at the Shoreline Historical Museum. And I have a little rack cards for people to look at. And these are we've got, sometimes you get your wish comes true. We were wishing that this would happen and that we'd get money for it. And an anonymous donor came through. And we thought we had 14 months and we had 8 weeks. So we're putting it together pretty quickly. But that's only the first of the good news. And then we got a Rotary grant, and we just left this afternoon, we got the King Conservation Grant. So the whole process will not only be planted as an urban forest. And what it is we're going to put 1,200 trees in 3,000 square feet. And we think it's, I think it's important to Lake Forest Park is it's a demonstration project. And you can put these Milwaukee forests in 2 parking spaces, which means you could, there may be some political, some comp plan issues about whether they should be required in every redevelopment of parking lots. But that it's an amazing thing. We're going to have the dedication on September 9th, and our Duwamish, we have some Duwamish elders and some Yakima elders who are going to come in and be part of the dedication. And then we're going to have, we think 100 people, we're going to have more than 100 people coming, but 100 people planting in teams of 10. The notion being that they then own the forest. It'll have a pathway. 3 elements are that it'll have 1,200 trees. That includes, shrubs, different kinds of trees. And a pathway so that there'll be a way to go through the forest and a gathering space so docents and teachers can use that as a piece. But it's also a museum. And because it's a museum, there'll be changing displays that talk about the intersection between human and natural history. So I just wanted to let you know that because I think it's going to have some implications for how you think about reforesting. And the thing about this is in 3 years, we'll know if it's actually working. In 3 years, it should be 10 feet tall and self-sustaining.
Will you tell us what a Milwaukee forest is?
Yes, a man named Mr. Miyawaki is named after him. He's a Japanese environmentalist who's and he was trying to figure out how that you could reforest Japan after it had been essentially deforested. And the only places that seemed to be thriving were the temples where they hadn't deforested. And he began to look at asking the question, how can you create a forest that mimics the natural forest, but that comes together in, so you're using all natural, all native plants wherever you are. You put them in, you densely packed, biodiverse, and they grow because they're competing. They have to have light. That's you can't places in Lake Forest Park. But they compete for light. They grow fast, and because they grow fast, they will, from the Climate Action Committee's point of view, they will sequester the same amount of carbon in 10 years as a historic forest does in 100. So it has an incredible number of benefits, but I think the biggest benefit is we'll be able to see it. And once you can see it and we can show it to people, it'll be something that can happen in a variety of places. So it's very exciting.
Is this an active museum?
Yes, we only got a third of it. We asked for all of it, but we only got a third of it.
Start somewhere.
But Sarah, I just want to say, I'm just kind of amazed that this is the fastest funding I've ever heard of for any kind of project. So I think it's an indication of the interest in it. So
we call this project sticky. There's something about it. We've got 90 volunteers. It's really something. And they're from all over. One of the things, a lot of the leadership is from Lake Forest Park on this issue. Sally Yamasaki is really the real leader in this, and she's done an extraordinary amount of work. But it's I don't know, it just is attractive to people. I think it's because it's something you can do. It's right away, but I'm with you. You know, I've raised money my whole life, but this really is fast.
So Sarah, I have a quick question for you and it's a little off base. So I've worked with the ACKNOWLEDGMENT Nation for 20 years. So when you know who the elder is who's coming, would you just send me an email or a
Mary Lee
text?
Jones.
Okay, thank
is
you.
coming.
Yeah,
That's the only one that I know at this point. We're meeting tomorrow to sort of
Okay.
flesh this out. And then many of you may know Edie Lawyer Nelson, who's a local Duwamish elder. She's on the board of the museum, and there'll be additional elders from the Duwamish tribe.
okay, thank you.
Okay.
Sarah, I have one question about, for us, for the climate, action committee, and that is, sounds like you'll try to get on the council's calendar in January. Will you, do a practice session with us, or?
Sure, that'd be terrific.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you, and then maybe it can also help, spread the word faster.
Great, that's great. Yes. Okay, great.
Sir,
Thank you.
just one comment, NPR this morning, US government just released its climate change report. I don't know if you've seen that. It basically messages that people of color, the nationalities, are the ones that are being impacted the most by climate change. So I think it might be a good thing to review when thinking about your own.
It's very hard. One of the issues we're frankly seriously struggling with, and finally we said we can't do it and it needs to be done, is an environmental justice review. We just didn't have the capacity in-house, and we looked at a couple of places where we might be able to find somebody, and they brought us a proposal and it was, wrong. It didn't suit our needs at this point. So we decided we weren't going to stop, but that clearly that's an issue. I appreciate you bringing it up again, because it needs to keep coming up again and again.
That's why the demonstration project element of this is very good. Because it can be applied elsewhere. So maybe that's part of the environmental justice component dispersal.
Yeah, it's a tough one, the good news is nobody's building on, toxic land dumps, creosote factories, things like that. So that's our, we have, and I think the other issue we're struggling with, and I suppose you are too, is the intersection between racial injustice in the covenants and housing issues, and how that leads into, is that a climate justice issue? It's probably not, but it needs attention. So that economic justice and climate justice are. And if anybody wants to come and plant a tree, you can sign up there on that email address down at the bottom of that record.
I appreciate you bringing that up, David. I was just at a youth climate summit this last week. And one of the workshops I attended was looking at the intersectionality between social justice, environmental justice, and climate justice. And one of the things that makes it tough is that we're trying to do work in response to climate on top of systems that are already broken. And so it is going to take that sort of we'll have to attack this on multiple fronts. There's not just a silo called climate. We are going to have to be really clear about all of our goals and values on all these fronts, which is, I think, a really nice context for the comprehensive plan, and looking for ways to upend policies or introduce policies that will help us move past some of those systematic failures.
It's interesting, I think on the NPR piece, because I was catching it on the ride home tonight, it was saying something that some analysis has shown, and I may have misheard it, but that in historically redlined neighborhoods, they tend to have lesser tree density. And that's maybe one of the byproducts of how people in those communities were kept out of that aspect of environmental equity. So I wonder if, as part of the sound transit kind of work and money we're going to be getting from trees, I know there's been talk about, having a program to kind of reforest or replant trees in areas to homeowners who want them in those kind of underserved areas. I wonder if there's a lens we could look at from that perspective. And we have all these great kind of maps, kind of overlaying kind of income levels and ethnicity and everything else on our town, it would be interesting to see what the overlay is between tree density and historically redlined parts of the town, because there are large parts of the town that I think UW has kind of interactive maps that they put out from their research showing kind of what parts of our town were subject to restrictive covenants and racial restrictive covenants.
Well, and how do we make sure when we build affordable housing as part of apartments that there's greenery as opposed to a few little measly bushes in the parking strip, which to me is kind of the shoreline model today.
Being in that job for a few years now. Yeah, I think that's interesting, and with the trees, you know, perhaps there are some opportunities too. Particularly at the north end of our city where there's a lack of parks. That maybe, you know, maybe some of that money could be used to help secure parks and then, you know, forest those areas where they're not at this time. Yeah, there's a lot to be done, a lot of work. Okay, thank you, Sarah. I appreciate you being here. It's on you, Councilmember Bodie.
Yes, so I wanted to say, good news, finally, the reasonable use exception ordinance was went to public hearing and was passed by the council. So thank you so much. That was, for those of you who are newer, that was actually an initiative of the Planning Commission. And it was triggered by a neighbor of one of these properties coming and just presenting to the Planning Commission and to the council. So literally, it was one person whose actions kind of, you know, had tentacles out. And then our former planning director spent a lot of time with the group talking about his observations from the process. Nick was part of that discussion too. And so I think we actually have put something very good in place that allows people who buy unbuildable pieces of land to build something, but balances it in terms of size, scale, and environmental protection, and also continuity over time of the provisions that are applied. So you know, just briefly, there are deed restrictions put in place for the parts of the property that are preserved as part of the exchange for being able to build in an unbuildable area. So that's something that travels with the land in perpetuity. So it's a little bit like a conservation easement, if you're familiar with those. We are also, Phil, we never adopted the sign ordinance, right?
You did not.
Yes. So that is something that I've asked that we try to do this year if possible. And so I don't know if you have an update on that.
We located it, I think, yesterday or today, and so we've got that.
I'm pretty sure the draft that we had was okay with everyone.
Yeah,
at
there
that
were a
point.
couple comments from the planning commission public hearing of the owners of the town. So
Oh,
had some
right,
concerns,
right.
and so I've got the short memo. from
Okay.
the Planning.
So we
commission.
had, we did have the public hearing. That's what I thought.
Not with the council. Yeah, we had a planning commission.
Oh,
public hearing.
planning commission public
Yeah,
hearing.
there's still.
So we
a
still
process
have to
go through
do
with the city
that
council.
process.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So soon, we will adopt that. And we're also looking at an unfinished business, though was not from the planning commission, a process for residential parking permits. And that's triggered a bit by Sound Transit and, you know, no park and ride parking officially at town center to be available, and also potentially by the park. And just so you know, that doesn't mean 24/7. That can mean, you know, certain hours, it can mean certain duration, but 60% of the residents would have to, of the lot owners would have to agree to it or petition for the permit process. So those are a few things that are kind of on our leftovers list, but to try to get done before we have a whole new council in place. And we adopted the updated budget. You know, we adopt a 2-year budget formally, but there are always adjustments at the midpoint. So we adopted midpoint adjustments and nothing. I think the most important thing to note is that retention of police officers funding and funding for our new 911 dispatch service, which had to migrate to a different location. Bothell was giving us kind of a sweetheart deal, and that then Bothell was moving. So we had some, increased demands for funding, but luckily we figured out how to handle those. So anything else, Bill, that you think? Yeah, we've had some busy council meetings going through all the budget items, but other than that, we're having a council dinner at local 104 tomorrow night, which is officially a public meeting because we're gonna have a forum there. But we're not planning to talk business, but we probably will, say hello to the public who might show up.
So we're not invited to dinner, but we're invited to wait.
Yes, you're not invited to the dinner, but you will. I mean, you're invited.
Table adjacent.
Yeah, table adjacent. That's good. Yes.
Well, thank you. When you were talking about budgeting, one of the things that had come up in some of our conversations during the RDW was the capacity of our planning department to keep up with what can be kind of intensive tracking of the remediation and the plans that are in place for our new properties. And then now with some of these legislative priorities that have come down the pike, is there a conversation now, starting now, to begin to think about as more permits potentially are coursing for a city, for ADUs and for duplexes and so forth, of making sure that the team is staffed sufficiently to take that increase on?
So as far as I know, we have not looked at, we would actually like to staff up. So that's our first priority, and have our community development director position filled. We have not budgeted for any additional positions at this point, but the council is very firm in the thought that our permit fees should cover our actual costs. And we agreed that we were gonna true that up every couple of years.
Every 2 years.
Every 2 years. So we didn't true it up this year. We just added a standard kind of national escalator to it.
And we did the IBC, the building code.
Yeah.
We did that, but everything else we looked at.
Okay.
Yeah, but for the first time, we actually had not looked at it from that point of view. So a year ago, we actually, as part of the original budget, we actually updated our permit fees to try to track actual costs, which they had been lagging. So that's at least a help in terms of staff.
Sure.
So,
Okay. Yeah, I know some of those things can take a while, so starting the advocacy early can help us when we're, 2 years down the line and potentially see.
yes, and right now, there's not a lot of building, but that could change. So that's right.
Very good.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Anybody online have questions for Councilmember Bodie? All right. Very good. Well, Christina, we tried to move through that quickly, but you now have our rapt attention.
Great. I've got just a short discussion, and I wanted to save the bulk of tonight to talk more housing. So I will also try and keep my piece pretty short. So bear with me. Let me get this share. Okay, hopefully you all can see this title slide. So here we are today, somehow already about halfway through November, which is offensive to me, how quickly things are going. All right, a quick reminder, we're here to talk about the comp plan update due by the end of next year, and we're focusing on compliance with other plans and policies in a way that really makes sense for our community, which is undergirded by some meaningful public engagement. Tonight, I will be sharing a short set of project updates, and then I'm going to turn it over to David and Andrew from Leland to talk more about housing, which builds on the conversation we started back in September. So the project updates that I have to share are that we were awarded the middle housing grant we applied for. This is going to let us perform some additional housing analysis. Specifically, we're going to be able to take a deeper look at the alternative compliance pathway to accommodate some of the recent legislative changes and also support some code amendments that address that and parking. We also got the climate planning grant submitted. We're still waiting to hear back on that, but that would let us do some more specific planning around resilience and would also fund a vehicle miles traveled study that would help fine tune some of the greenhouse gas emissions reduction methods that we might incorporate into the climate element. So I'm glad to hear that the climate action plan is moving forward, and I hope that we hear about an award and can kind of dovetail these two processes together as we move ahead on climate planning. I also wanted to thank everyone that submitted their interest in working on a public engagement special working group or special working committee. My random number generator selected Maddie, Melissa, and David as the lucky engagement committee members. So welcome to the team. If you are no longer interested in volunteering to work specifically on engagement, let me know. But otherwise, I will be reaching out next week with some additional information. Some initial work that would be very helpful is some written feedback on the website content. We talked a little bit about that last time. But I haven't heard anything. So if you do have some specific suggestions, please let me know. Otherwise, we'll be talking about the draft survey questions that we're working on now, and then in the future, a little bit of support on planning the workshop and the open house that are part of our scope of work, and maybe leaning on you all for leading pop-up opportunities as those become available and as your availability allows. So just wanted to share that. Again, if you're no longer interested in supporting the committee, there were others who volunteered. So just let me know and we can do a quick switcheroo. And last time I promised to talk a little bit about what topics you would be reviewing. I will send this out via email for Phil to distribute after tonight's meeting. But at a first glance, first look at comparing kind of where housing is at, where transportation, things that they want to fit in, and kind of eyeballing based on the needs from the PSRC and GMA checklists that we talked about last time. This is what I think we're going to be tackling over the next 7 months. So tonight we're talking in more detail about housing. In December, given that it's so close to the holidays, we're going to keep it a little bit lighter with a discussion of the community profile that's present today in Lake Forest Park and land use. At the beginning of the year, we're going to hit land use again, followed by transportation, digging into climate, environmental quality, more housing, can never get enough housing, and then wrapping up climate, economic development, community services, and public safety, and then all of the capital facilities, utilities, and parks, trails, and open space stuff towards the summer. There is a little bit of room for float in our schedule if we need an extra one extra meeting on anything. And I know that this is going to be a lot of really packed agendas for the next many months. So thank you for bearing with us as we work really, really hard to meet that December 31st adoption deadline. This is, we're going to try and keep as close to the schedule as we can so City Council has enough time to review and get things moving in time for adequate notice and environmental review and everything. So again, there's a little bit of flexibility, but we're going to try and stick as close as we can to the schedule. And I guess with that, I'll open it up for any questions on what I've shared tonight and then turn it over to David and Andrew.
Does anybody online have questions? Cherie, Lois, Ashton? Christina, I'm sorry if I missed this. When I was watching y'all's meeting from last month, I don't know where to go to find like the slide decks or some of the notes. I didn't see where the web content was.
Yeah, so I think I'll work with Nick to make sure that those get shared out and posted to the website so that folks can find them. I'm not sure if the slide decks are usually downloadable from planning commission meetings or if people are just typically supposed to watch the recordings. But I'll provide the slide decks and we'll make sure that those get posted on the website.
Yeah, we could post any files that you give, so. I also want to mention too, we talked about some updates to the website last time, that those have been made, so if anybody checks it out, let me know how you think they look. And we can make any changes there too.
Yeah, I would just note, sometimes slide decks don't make it into the meeting materials. So it's good to at least check on that, and especially they're very informative, I think, and
Yeah.
easy for people to flip through, so.
Yeah, they're hard to see in the recording, Christina.
Okay.
That's part of it. But they're usually, we've had them in the past as PDFs. So they're just sent out as PDFs along with the meeting minutes typically.
Okay, I'll make sure and get all of the project slide decks to Nick to share out. Do you want them attached to the next meeting agenda or just posted on the website?
I think on the website's fine, just listed under like meeting materials, or I think it's called meeting packet.
Okay. Okay, I'll take care of that this week.
Thank you so much.
All right. If there are no other questions, then David, take it away.
Christina, no, I just have one other question.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. What do we need to be planning for? So I know that schedule that you just shared will be shared with us, but what can we be bringing to the table so that we're not simply passive, observers or reviewers of materials in any given evening, but that we come prepared with particular knotty problems or questions, that we can reflect on before our meetings? What will that process look like?
That's a great question. So and this was touched on a little bit last time. So the schedule is intended to help you be able to review the existing comp plan materials in advance of the meeting, the upcoming meeting, so that we're all able to have a really productive discussion. So for next time, I would like for you to please take a look at the land use chapter in both volume 1 and the supporting documentation in volume 2 of your existing comp plan. And then that will be the same homework on a rolling basis going forward. Of course, you won't have anything in your existing comp plan related to climate, but I will hope that you review the climate action plan, and I'll provide some additional resources about what the requirements are for planning around climate resilience and greenhouse gas emissions reduction in advance of those meetings. And the only element that we're really skipping is the Shoreline Master Program that was adopted or updated in 2019, and there aren't really any changes that are necessary for that to come into compliance with recent legislation. So we're gonna bypass that one, but everything else we're gonna touch on over the next several months. And you'll, when I send out the schedule, just know that I'm hoping that you will all make time to review both the goals and policies document as well as the background information that is part of your comp plan.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Then David.
All right. Can y'all hear me okay? Okay, well, nice to see you all again, commissioners, council member. It's been a couple months, so let me share my screen here and then I'll get us going. All right, are you all seeing this title slide?
Yes.
Great. All right. So this is just a reminder. So this, as like Christina said, is housing part 2. So in the packet we shared with you all last week, that included the content that we'll be reviewing today, but then also a reminder of the housing needs assessment packet 1 is sort of at the tail end of that, because as we're focusing on land capacity analysis today, that is supposed to be building off of the H&A work that was done previously, or it is. So, and there were some minor updates that were made to that housing needs analysis or assessment based on some of the feedback we'd received from you in our previous meeting. And so sharing that again with you, and I know that there was a lot of content in there. I'm not expecting that you would have necessarily reviewed all of it page for page, but it is a useful resource to refer back to as we talk about the land capacity analysis and how that will impact the next steps of this update to your housing element. And so today, as I mentioned, so we'll be talking about land capacity analysis. So it's a little bit more technical, less content than we reviewed last time for sure, but dense in terms of some of the technical elements and numbers that we'll be going through. And I'm sure that there'll be plenty of discussion and questions as we go along the way. So we'll be talking a little bit about the methods that were used in assessing the land capacity of Lake Forest Park to meet your housing needs. And that is, as we'll get into in a minute, when we say housing needs, there's number of layers that we're talking about there. One from the assessment that has been done, also about the housing targets that have been allocated to Lake Forest Park, as well as housing needs by income band, which is part of the newest legislation and GMA requirements. And lastly, so we'll talk about sort of how the land capacity is talking about, right, what you have capacity for within your current zoning. Whereas looking at actual production trends and the likelihood that you will, say, meet those targets is another piece of analysis and assessment that we've done. And that will lead to some of the further work that is known as adequate provisions within the Commerce guidance that we'll be introducing and talking about as part of our next steps in this process. And so just to sort of house this in the overall process, I know that you know, we've met now a few times talking about housing, and it will not be the last, as was mentioned. Though there will be quite a bit of work that needs to be done after this, so that we will be doing before I think we meet with you all again. So as of now, we have covered or have sort of completed these components of the update to your housing element in terms of this process. And this list here is part of, again, the Commerce guidance on how to update your comprehensive plan. So the housing needs assessment has been completed, at least in its draft form. That may evolve as we move forward. The land capacity analysis is what we're talking about today. And then over the next few months, we'll be working together with Phil and Nick and potentially some of you through various or through other means of communication to look at things at the adequate provisions. There'll be a look at racially disparate impacts, which is another part of the new requirements, legislative requirements in terms of assessing your regulations and code in terms of any racially disparate impacts related to housing in particular. The housing element review, and that's not to say, of course, we have reviewed your existing housing element already, but this is more of a formal process of going through and assessing the existing goals and policies and how they, whether or not they are adequate or inadequate in meeting your identified housing needs, which then leads to updating the goals and policies, which is where we'll be when we come back to you, most likely in March, is with some of those draft goals and policies to discuss with you and get more feedback and further flesh out and finalize as we work towards the implementation phase of the comp plan update. So that's just an overview of where we're at, what we'll be talking about today. Before we actually get into the meat of our discussion, wanted to pause there to see if you all have any questions about that. All right, great. So I will hand it over to Andrew here in just a moment. But before, I just wanted to give a quick reminder in terms of sort of a background piece that was covered in our housing needs assessment. And I should say, so similar to our previous meeting together, the packet that was sent out to you is a little more dense with information and text, whereas we've trimmed down some of those slides or pages here just for presentation purposes. So we'll be covering all the same content, but there may be some things that you have questions about, particular wording or things that are mentioned on those packet pages. So feel free to jump in with questions related to that as well.
David, I have a quick question.
Sure.
When you go through this analysis, how do you consider the difference between home ownership and rentals? Because, you know, I think like what I've always understood is the kind of average rent levels in Lake Forest Park are lower than surrounding areas, but maybe that's not true today, I don't know, but I at least understood that was true, at least, you know, over the years. And so how do you look at ownership, which is, you know, what's affordable for home ownership and what's an affordable rental are kind of two different levels, especially given our interest rates right now. So how do you look at that? Or maybe I'm being overly complex and you're looking at something else.
No, it's a really good question. So we did look into that as part of the initial housing needs assessment, because you're right, absolutely, affordability based on for a rental household versus home ownership is certainly different. When it comes down to the land capacity analysis, and Andrew, correct me here if I'm wrong, but I'm as far as I understand, there is no differentiation in terms of the way that this is broken out in housing needs by income. It is safe to assume that there, you know, for the capacity or housing needs identified, say for 0 to 80% AMI, that those would likely or be assumed to mostly be rental households. And then when you get into the sort of what is the moderate income, 80 to 120, often a mix, and then 120 and over, a mix as well, though a lot more home ownership just in terms of breakdown of household and tenure. But that's definitely a part of the conversation, just in terms of looking forward, the housing types that Lake Forest Park wants to support and promote. And looking at more affordable home ownership opportunities, we'll talk a little bit about some of those housing types, what that could mean. It's likely looking at more middle housing types, townhomes potentially. In some of the previous housing needs assessment work, I think it showed that some of the only real affordable house or ownership types that have been built in recent years are in the townhome category. And so understanding, a new single family home is not going to be affordable to anyone under 120 or more percentage of the AMI. How do we promote some of the other housing types to be constructed over the next 5, 10, 20 years, if that is a goal of the city?
That's what raises my question. Because if I were part of a young person or couple looking to buy a house today, I wouldn't, I'd rent a house. So I'm thinking not just about rental apartments, but rental houses. In other words, I don't think if you're at 80 to if you're at middle housing, some of that may actually be rental houses.
Yeah.
That's kind of the nuance I was getting at, rather than assuming you have to have, because of the rapid escalation in prices in our community lately, honestly, they're not affordable to me.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I
So-
think maybe part of what you're getting at too is helping us as a group to better understand that balance between a variety of housing types and sizes that could be owned and being very appealing to investors. And I think I can't speak for everybody here, but I would hope that we would all agree that we're really interested in the underlying mechanisms that are turning some communities into investments. And so there are increased numbers of rental units at the expense of some of the equity issues we've been talking about, which is what are the triggers that help bring a whole variety of income levels into home ownership versus making our community very attractive for real estate investment, rental income. I'm not saying this well. If somebody knows where I'm
No,
headed, like,
you are, I mean, anecdotally, a significant percentage of the townhouses, for example, in Southern Gateway were bought by investors.
Right.
Rather than, homeowners.
so I think David and Andrew, it would be really helpful. I'm guessing you are both pretty well versed on this phenomenon nationally. It's been well written about in sort of typical media outlets, the kind of the layman's, access point for a lot of this information. But I think we'll be really interested in understanding how policies that we may, or I guess not in the comp plan, but policies in the comp plan, but not necessarily code, how those policies can truly help disrupt the equity related issues regarding housing, versus turning ourselves into targets for investment property for folks that are just looking for rental income. I think that would be important for us to consider. It's definitely happening all around us.
Yeah, I've made a note, and it is a really important thing to talk about, and we all know, like you said, that there has been a fair amount of investor activity, especially in single family markets as well, and that's caused problems nationwide. I think that the way that the analysis is kind of proceeding, we had a lot of data about tenure and the needs of different household types and affordability of rental versus ownership housing in the housing needs assessment that we talked about back in September, and that sort of will carry forward into the more qualitative, so to speak, goals and policies work, and I think that this is also obviously an equity issue, and so as we talk about that later on in the process, I think that stuff will come back around. In the middle here is this sort of more technical analysis that we're talking about tonight, where we are really looking at housing types specifically, and those of course are related to both rental ownership and also income levels. So ensuring that there's the capability to build a sufficient amount of housing of various types that could be affordable to various income levels, is sort of the first step. And then the next step on top of that will be, what are the policies that would enable the city to, encourage those to, for example, be affordable homeownership opportunities, or all the stuff you were just mentioning there. So I think that this is sort of a middle step in between that need that we talked about last time and the policies that we can use to achieve that.
And I think where we get sort of at the end of our presentation today is going to begin to speak exactly to that, some of the additional housing types that the city may consider, and how we can begin to gear our further work, as Andrew said, which is really getting into the fun and an important part of this, which is how do we craft the goals and policies and then further implementation actions to achieve the types of goals and outcomes that we're talking about. So I think we do, it's a much shorter presentation we have today, so I think hopefully we can get through it and then start to have more of these conversations to guide our further work for you all as well.
Thanks, David.
For sure. So that's to say, so I was sort of speaking to this without sharing the slide. You were already asking the question about how these breakdown by income bands work. This is just a reminder that when we're talking about housing needs by income, this is your overall growth target of 870 units that was in the King County countywide planning policies, and then broken down by the different income bands by housing need in Lake Forest Park. And so this is part of the analysis when we're looking at capacity. Part of it, again, is that overall citywide goal of 870, but then understanding from these income levels. And as you can see here, that the largest sort of gap or net new need, as it's shown here, is in that 0 to 80% range, which is likely no surprise to the folks here, as most of the housing within Lake Forest Park today is affordable to that higher percentage of AMI. So that's where the current gap is within the housing inventory of Lake Forest Park. And on the right here is just showing sort of when we're talking about these different income band brackets, we're really talking about these different housing types as defined by Commerce and just also by the market and affordability. So we'll be digging into this a little bit further. Andrew will talk more to this, how that factored into the actual analysis, and how it's broken down by your zoning code, etc. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Andrew, to get into the nuts and bolts of how we did the land capacity.
Okay, thank you. So here's the land capacity analysis. There are 6 steps that we're going to talk about. Trying to make the numbers as palatable as possible here. I've phrased them as questions so we can answer the questions for you, hopefully, and at least start to answer the questions. So proceeding sort of logically, you just look at the whole city, looking at where all that new housing, the 870 units could go, how much land is available for new housing. And this is based on buildable lands and, there's county's assessment of redevelopability, as well as previous efforts that the city has undertaken, such as the plan for the town center. Then we are going to look and see on those, on that land, what density of housing could be built on it, what types of housing and how many units. And then there's these 2 steps, 3 and 4, which are sort of extra analyses that are new as required by this new legislation that's coming in around both duplexes in the case of Lake Forest Park and ADUs. So how many duplexes might we see? It doesn't make sense that someone would even build a duplex on in a single family lot in the city. And then how many ADUs might get built in the next 20 years based on both the land availability and what's already been happening in the city, because you have been seeing an increase in ADU permitting. And then you add this all up, look at how many units can be accommodated, and then at the end we do sort of the same thing as we saw on the last slide. Take those units capacity and then look at where that lands as far as the income bands go.
Andrew, can I ask a question? How do 3 and 4 relate? I know we were, as a council, asking the question of whether we were hoping it didn't mean you could have 4 living units on one property, and that it was additive, the duplex, the middle housing provisions and the ADU legislative provisions. So we were assuming you would kind of read them together. But how did you get any more guidance on that, or how have you used those as additive assessments? In other words, first you look at whether you can put a duplex, and then you look at whether you could add ADUs even if there is a duplex. So that's the part I was questioning.
It's a very good question, and one that Commerce and the state have been struggling with because of the way that these 2 separate bills, HB 1110 and 1337, were written. It is somewhat unclear whether or not cities which are required to allow duplexes on every lot are also required to allow 2 ADUs in addition to the duplex. So there's a little bit of wiggle room. There's also going to be some, well, everyone is assuming that there's going to be some, lawsuits about this eventually, which will clarify what's going on. But at the moment, the guidance is vague about it. So yes, but for the purposes of this analysis, separate from what has to go in the code, this is simply looking at capacity. And the way that we did this analysis was to look at them separately and to assume that only a certain percentage of people who have the capability of developing a duplex or adding an ADU would choose to do so over the 20-year planning horizon. And in fact, a very small percentage of people who could do that would do so. So there's really overlap. This is not looking at total capacity for if every single lot in Lake Forest Park would have an ADU. We're really dialing that back to what we think might actually happen. So no, there's not an overlap in these numbers, so to speak. And as far as what goes in the code, I think we will continue to, watch what happens from the Commerce guidance.
That's helpful, and I didn't realize that you had dialed back from total capacity to.
Yeah, you'll see.
Kind of realistic capacity. Thank you.
Yeah, it is one of numerous questions that are as yet unresolved with all of this new legislation.
Yes, absolutely. And we'll just look at the numbers here in a second, but I just wanted to mention on that, the overarching methodology is to look at the capacity that is sort of the maximum capacity that it's also feasible or reasonable to assume. So Commerce is not asking us to look at the 100% full build out, if everything were to redevelop at a certain density, because obviously that is not likely to occur. But similarly, there may be changes in the economy and in the market and in zoning over the next 20 years that may incentivize different things to occur. So we're trying to take a middle ground and look at things, a reasonable amount of development to assume that could occur, to see if it's feasible to reach the housing target under your current zoning. But it's not the absolute maximum. So okay, let's go on to the next slide, and we'll get there. All the numbers are in here. So we split this out into two categories: single family zones and town center and southern gateway as a group of parcels. And so for the town center and southern gateway, of course, there's been previous master planning done. There's been new zoning adopted in town center and southern gateway. So we basically just went with the assumptions that have already occurred to as to what the density would be. The density cap in town center is in the zoning code. In the southern gateway, we looked at a certain amount of acres that could redevelop based on most of those parcels redeveloping. And then, like I was just mentioning, there's this commerce market factor. So that takes away 15 to 25% of the developable acreage based on things that might happen over time. Someone doesn't want to sell their property. There's not a good market, like at the moment with high interest rates. There's a large parcel that needs to be subdivided and some roads are constructed, so you obviously can't build housing on those roads, or stormwater, landscaping, trees, etc. And so that's where this is where we get our total acreage here. And then in the single family zones, we took a slightly different approach, looking at the King County buildable lands inventory, what parcels were classified as vacant or redevelopable from that process. And then, of course, there's a lot of critical areas in Lake Forest Park, wetlands, slopes, geohazards, etc. So we looked at how many acres of constrained land there were on those parcels, took that out, and then dialed that back, here in the last step, also based on a similar pace of development that has been seen in single family zones over the past decade. And so this just shows how many acres there are per zone, that we used as the basis for the land capacity analysis. And as you can see, it's probably not surprising. Town center has about 13 acres. Some of the single family zones have some redevelopment potential, particularly larger lots. And then of course the southern gateway has a fair amount of developable acreage. So this is what it looks like on the map, just to sort of see that process I just mentioned. On the left, we see green are lots that were classified as redevelopable by the buildable lands. It's a lot of acreage. Vacant lots are in blue. And then on the right is after looking at the environmental restrictions. So there's a lot of critical areas. As you can see, the parcels that are in red are entirely taken out of the equation because they fall within these critical areas, and then sort of prorated based on how much of the parcel is within the critical area. So it's not to say that there isn't some potential for, we were just talking about reasonable use exceptions for something to occur, for somebody to build in some constrained area, but as a base amount of acreage to look at, it seemed prudent to take that as a baseline number.
Andrew, question?
Yep.
I really struggled with this the critical areas analysis in a couple ways. One is not all critical areas are the same.
Yes.
And what you've put on here shows everything.
Mhm.
It is erosion potential, steep slopes, landslide hazards, stream buffers, wetlands. And frankly, the erosion hazard mainly affects the seasonality of construction.
Mhm.
MPs. It does not limit capacity.
Mhm.
The landslide hazards are actually pretty similar unless you're in a really steep area. It triggers a requirement to do a study and show that you're not destabilizing slopes. But I'm someone who has a bunch of these things on my property, so of course I zoomed into your maps and looked at my parcel.
Mhm.
And it doesn't make sense. So, for example, in my case, I have two parcels, but the main parcel, when you add the landslide hazard on there, it takes almost half of my property supposedly out of redevelopment, which when you look at it on the ground is a ridiculous statement to me. It doesn't make any sense. So I'm pretty concerned about the use of all critical areas as one blanket thing for this exercise, because I think it artificially reduces, the numbers that we're seeing. And just to be clear, I have no interest. I'm never going to redevelop. I'm going to die in my house, I think, and my kids can figure it out from there. But the point is, I think the assumption that we can just overlay all critical areas is questionable. So, I might have some suggestions for how we might do this a couple of ways. If you do it this way, it feels like it's almost reflecting a policy choice that we want to limit development wherever we can based on what the legislature said. And I think that's a policy decision that's going to come to the commission and the public and the council, not for us to decide now. So this is like a bookend to me. Another would be, well, let's take the streams and the wetlands, which actually have very kind of specific, clearly measurable limits, and then do that, because in all these creek canyons, it's the landslide, the steep slope, and the erosion that create these giant pink blobs that aren't in fact going to limit development.
Yanni, though, don't you think though that in this case that the fact that they're using this as a model has more to do with sort of saying like, yeah, there will be development. We're not saying that this prohibits development. We're just saying we want a real honest look at what's most likely, like lots that are not going to have a lot of the expenses associated with that. It's not, I don't think we're saying we won't allow development there. We just are trying to figure out where the tension points are for achieving our goals.
I agree with you to a point, but those certain critical areas, like for those who don't know, the landslide hazards, most of it is based on analysis done in before 1990. And that makes sense. It's meant to be a screening tool to look at slope and soil type. That's about it. So what that does is if you come in as a homeowner or a developer, it says, you know what, you might be in a landslide area. So yeah, you're going to need to show that this isn't going to be a problem. In most cases, it's not. So to me, and I played out this whole scenario of how we went from this map to the next maps around where could you have a duplex. So this assumption that all critical areas kind of significantly limit the development capacity, I think is leading us down a path of significantly underestimating what's actually possible up there. So I agree with you partly, but to a significant degree for those critical areas, I disagree.
I really appreciate that, Yana. Thanks for that comment. And I also wanted to, well, okay, there's several approaches. I mean, yes, we could definitely take some of the landslide and erosion hazards out of here. It would increase the amount of single family parcels. I think that my initial thinking in using the maximum amount would be was to see if the capacity in vacant and redevelopable parcels that had no environmental constraints whatsoever would be sufficient to meet the needs of the housing target as as sort of provided by Commerce and by the county, and it is. So I think that from the perspective of pure capacity to meet the housing target goes, adding more capacity in these zones by limiting which critical areas we look at, it would show that you have excess capacity to meet the needs of units that could be redeveloped in those zones. And I do hear you that especially for things like ADUs and duplexes, it does affect where we're showing that those could go and how many. And it may definitely be worth looking at those again without these constraints. But I think from the pure redevelopable or redevelopability analysis here, I agree that it's not it shouldn't be misconstrued, and we want to make sure it's not misconstrued as a sort of policy statement, because and to keep sort of mathematical, so that we can.
And to your point, I mean, I think we can, as you said, this is sort of representing an overly conservative look, a bookend, as you said. I think we can sort of adjust or provide another scenario that may remove some of those less environmentally constrained areas to see how that would change some of this capacity.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I think this is very useful as a bookend and for getting at the question that Andrew said, which is, can we meet capacity now? I think that is useful, but I think as a depiction of what's kind of possible, and not even just slightly probable, but possible, this is not, it doesn't meet that test for me.
Yeah.
Because so many of these critical areas don't in fact limit how much you can develop on the site. It limits the cost a bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's carry on, and having noted that we could definitely provide another scenario here, well, we don't have the other numbers now, so we'll go on with these for the moment. So, okay, we have established a set of parcels and a certain amount of acreage, and now we need to apply some density assumptions. As I mentioned, we have your 17 units an acre from the town center in the zoning code, and for the southern gateway, we wanted to look at a sort of potential mix of development types based on regional examples in the area of both podium development, like you see here, and as well as townhomes, such as the ones that are behind the arterial there in the southern gateway right now. So averaging those two development types, I think it was 60-40. We came up with 63 units an acre as a sort of just a general idea of the density development, which is both allowed in the code and also sort of likely based on regional examples and what's happening nearby in Seattle and the shoreline, et cetera.
Andrew, I have a quick question. It's come to my attention that the zoning along Bothell Way at Southern Gateway is for 7 stories, which is very tall. We don't have anything 7 stories around here. We have a lot of 5s.
Yeah.
And those look pretty big. And so if by chance the city, the council made a decision to change Southern Gateway from 7 stories to 5 stories, similar to town center, would that seriously affect your calculations here?
I believe I used 5-story prototypes.
Thank you so much.
I'm not 100% sure about that, so I'll have to look back in the data. So I'll definitely make it a point to look back.
If you did, that's great. So thank you. I just was worried you might have used 7, in which case we would be locked in some way.
Well, I will say that that 5-story use of prototype that Andrew mentioned, right, is based on what we're seeing today, what's sort of happening in the market today. I will say that especially as some of the math changes, it becomes increasingly expensive to build. There may be pressure to sort of from a developer perspective need to increase the density in order to make a project pencil. So that's where in some places, many places throughout the region, they're sort of, though there's not development happening currently today above 5 stories, there's a recognition that if you're limiting that into the future, there is a possibility you then may be constricting and preventing development from happening, say 10 years from now. Not saying that is 100% the case, but it is something to consider as we continue down this sort of through this process.
Thank you, but if the math was based on current 5-story, most likely development for the multifamily, that satisfies my question.
Okay. So so that takes care of the basic math for the majority of vacant redevelopable land. Then we looked at middle housing as we mentioned. So you know, again, here we're going to encounter these critical areas again. So taking into account what Jana had mentioned, this analysis was to look and see how many parcels might be feasible for building a duplex. So we looked at the lot coverage ratio, which you can see there by zone. So that's the total amount of area obviously you can build on. We took out environmentally constrained acreage. We looked at which parcels would still have 3,000 buildable square feet left over after lot coverage ratio and or environmental constraints were taken into account. And then, so on the far right, you see the orange parcels are ones that, you know, still had potential space for a duplex. And then we looked at the financial feasibility as a next step. So on the next slide, this is a sort of distillation of the process, but basically we looked at what Commerce and has provided as a sample pro forma for middle housing development to be used in these comp plan processes. So they have this, you know, estimated sales price for different housing types in each PSRC community, and the amount of cost that we estimate based on current market it would cost to develop such a unit, how much return the developer would need to make in order to undertake such an venture, and then how much money would be left over to buy a parcel that they were going to do this on. That's the residual land value there. So we estimate that, you know, on a very high level analysis, somewhere around $330,000, you know, you could buy a parcel that's either vacant or has a house on it, take the house down, or redevelop the vacant parcel into a duplex. So the number of parcels you see on the map is very small, 53 parcels total. So this, what it really shows is that land and housing costs obviously are expensive in Lake Forest Park, as we know. So the feasibility of developing, even though duplexes will have to be allowed citywide, the feasibility of developing them is relatively slim. In other words, there's not a lot of places where it makes sense to do so. But we did want to account for the fact that this new legislation has come into effect and assume that some of these over 20 years might redevelop into duplexes. And of course, the market may change over time, as David was saying, I think as well. So it's very hard to know, but we added a very conservative estimate of 26 additional housing units from this analysis.
Andrew, quick question. I struggled with this slide a little because can you just clarify on each, you've got 4 numbers.
Yeah.
Are the sale prices per unit, so for each unit of the duplex, is the same for cost per unit, and is a residual land value for the entire parcel or per unit on the parcel? Like I was trying to basically do the math and it wasn't penciling out. So can you just clarify what these are?
Yeah, well, there's a much more complicated spreadsheet that I didn't want to put on the slide. So, but yes, it is per unit. So it's the sales price per unit. The cost per unit is and the residual land value is for the whole thing. So that takes into account the rate of return. It takes into account hard costs, soft costs. What else is on there, David? We can share it with you if you want to look. And so this is just sort of intended to be a simplified version of it. But yes, the land value is for the whole parcel. So that would be not per unit.
Whereas, and I think maybe where the confusion is coming from is the potential sale price is a per unit, and the cost of development or construction is per unit. Whereas then the residual land value is for the entirety of the parcel. So it's not, for example, it's not 330 times 2, accounting for sort of the leftover for each unit.
Yeah.
That's the total.
I should have made this slide more clear on the actual math.
Thanks, no, that's what I was getting at, David. It would be good to just make that really clear on here. This next question kind of takes us back several slides, but it's important for this one. So when you did the capacity per zone,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't see a step in there unless it was somehow kind of incorporated in the county's buildable lands thing. But again, I'm gonna talk by way of my own example. I've got my main parcel is basically 40,000 acres, okay? The zoning is 15,000.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I have one house.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So what I didn't see playing out in these numbers, if I'm reading it right, is that I could already, with current code, subdivide my parcel and build 2.
Yes, that is incorporated in here, and I'll explain how.
That'd be great, because I was kind of scratching my head.
Yes,
This is the slide you were referring to, right?
Yeah, or the context of it, because I was shocked at how few acres and maybe it was the earlier one where it said, how many acres are, yeah, that one. Like, I'm like, really? I'm looking at RS15 and I'm like, I have a redevelopable acre all by myself. So I'm just trying to understand the math. Sorry, I actually get into spreadsheets, so I kind of want to know how the math works.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No need to apologize. So the reason why the large quantity of redevelopable parcels has been reduced a great amount is because we're not assuming that redevelopment of all those green parcels that we saw on the map will occur in 20 years based on the pace of redevelopment in the past 20 years, and even if it were to accelerate. So that's the market factor or the reduction factor that is recommended to, that Commerce wants you to look at in this analysis, so that, as I sort of mentioned earlier, that there may be hundreds and hundreds of acres that could redevelop, but recent activity in Lake Forest Park would not indicate that many acres would redevelop. So that's one reason why you're seeing much less acreage in the grand total adjusted acreage than you're seeing here on the map. But to your other point, we did use a density assumption. If you go 2 slides forward, there we go. These density assumptions in the single family zones are based on the minimum lot size. So when there's a vacant or redevelopable parcel in a single family zone that has fewer than the allowed units in the code, as yours does, and that parcel is considered to be, or that acreage is considered to be redevelopable, it would be considered to redevelop at the higher density, at the maximum density allowed in the code under the zone. So what that would essentially be is exactly as you described. It would represent somebody subdividing the property and building another house on it. That's allowed currently under the zoning, not accepting any changes that might be made. So it does work out in there that is what's happening on those parcels that are in zones that are not maxed out as the zone capacity.
Okay, last question for now, I promise. So one thing that was a little confusing when you then went through the steps on the next slides about taking out critical areas and stuff, it's that subdivision piece needs to come in before you do that.
Right, these are exceptions. So the where we left off in the previous slide, the total amount of acreage by zone and the amount of density by zone is the base level analysis, right? So that would include the subdivision, it include redevelopment of town center or whatever. And then on top of that, we're adding on a parcel level middle housing and ADUs. It is really confusing. because the new legislation requires that the allowances for ADUs and middle housing be made on a by parcel level, right? So 1 unit per lot, or a duplex per lot, rather than per acre. Whereas the previous land capacity analysis and the land capacity analysis by income band guidance is by acre. So there's two parallel things going on. There's looking at the acreage and how much density you could fit on that acreage, and then there's adding on top of it what you could do on a lot as far as ADUs and duplexes go, because of the legislation considers those things separately on a lot by lot basis as opposed to a zone wide basis. Does that make sense?
It does. I was just trying to make sure I had the sequence of math right. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. No, and I'm sorry it's so confusing. It's challenging to figure out the best way to lay it all out, because there are a lot of layers of things going on at the same time.
Andrew, can we just just to put a pin on this, like I'm on slide 17, and so for example, RS20, your calculation is 2.2 dwelling units per acre. But if you do have an RS20 lot, assume that it's already been subdivided as much as it can. Under our current code, you could actually have up to 3 dwelling units, right? Because you could have your primary structure, an attached ADU, and a detached ADU. So I think that might help reveal the math, if you could explain what the 2.2 means versus 3.
I think the 2.2 was 1 unit per, yeah, right, I see what you're saying about 3. Okay. I need to think about that.
I don't think it's important that we get to resolution today, because I appreciate the broader picture, and I'd like us to get back on track with that.
I agree.
I appreciate the walk through the methodology, and it is complex, but I think there's a little bit of refinement to go. I don't want to slow you guys down.
Yeah.
Addressing like what are the key assumptions that have been
Totally, and I think that this is super dense, and I think they're important.
But it is challenging to say. So if you have 1 unit per 20,000 square feet or whatever, then the fact that an ADU, I think you have to treat the ADU separately. Like the fact that an ADU could be built doesn't mean that you would immediately add that density to the minimum unit density in the code, because then that would imply that whenever you build a house, you build an ADU, and it's the same. So I think that's why we were separating out ADUs, and also to be clear, we weren't just looking at ADU feasibility or how many ADUs you could fit, because their ADU laws are changing, because you already, as you said, you already do allow them. So I think that we attempted to, what it's essentially doing would be, another way to accomplish, sorry, we can talk about this all day, but, so if you're talking about ADUs, if you have a single family zone and you allow ADUs, you can either account for those in this analysis by adding them into the total density per lot, like, increase this from 2.2 to 3 or 3.5 or whatever it would be, based on what percentage of houses you expect would redevelop with an ADU or ADUs would redevelop. Or you could do it on a parcel by parcel basis separately, which is what we did instead. So I think that to do it the other way would be double counting in a way. But it also, because the mechanism of why and where and how people build ADUs is different from why and where and how they build single family homes or redevelop single family homes without ADUs. I think that's why we try to keep them conceptually separate.
And if I could just sort of back it up just a second, I think the reason we sort of laid it out as we did, aside from the reasons Andrew just explained, that ADU calculation is a different sort of beast in and of itself. So this slide that we're looking at now is based on the base zoning, right? And then sort of building off of that in each individual step. Understanding in your base zoning there is an ADU allowed. However, the calculus around whether or not an ADU would be put on an individual parcel is going to be different. So it's where we tried to sort of lay it out as building one step on another. But your concerns are definitely understood. It's not the sort of the simplest path to follow necessarily.
I think it's important too, just because it does help us diversify our housing types.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're looking at square footage. the calculation that's going to go into new construction to build a duplex, for example, or convert your house to be a duplex is a different, from a cost basis than making a choice to have a small ADU that can provide that other housing type that we're so lacking in our community. And we might affect that with code and incentives. That's really where we're going to see the most traction on attracting smaller, households or households that are looking for smaller spaces. Anyway.
Said differently, we might prefer the ADU mechanism to the duplexes if they're both adding density to single family lots.
Right, and affordability. I think that's the thing. The townhomes, I know in your calculation here that townhomes aren't affordable either. I could not afford a townhome right now.
Yeah.
So, I don't think of those townhomes as being affordable options, but an ADU, at least on a rental basis, could be affordable. Okay, I think we should move along.
I agree.
Thank you so much.
I think just to again put a pin in your point there, I think we can certainly talk about these numbers ad nauseum. I think we can refine them and then tweak them a little bit based on some of our feedback here. But I think the high level takeaways that we're talking through are sound in most cases. And to your point, the sort of the feasibility of developing a duplex or an ADU, and sort of our calculations here showing that in general, even if the code changes, we'll have to change to allow for a duplex. The feasibility around constructing that is still going to make it difficult, just sort of by the market standard. You're not going to necessarily see in the immediate term a huge production of duplexes occurring in your city. However, as a policy decision, there may be ways that you could incentivize that to change that math if that is an outcome that you are looking to see. Same with ADUs, because of historic trends of ADUs and just what we're seeing around the region, and Lake Forest Park not being inner Seattle, the expectation of how many ADUs you're gonna see in the city are still relatively low, based on existing sort of factors. But there are potential steps that can be taken if that's something that is seen as desirable or that you want to encourage. And so I think that's definitely the important next step and sort of key takeaway to take from this is if those are decisions or the direction that this commission and the city wants to take, those are steps that we can look into, and it would definitely change some of this math.
I do think we want to be careful about assumptions on what we've seen historically with ADUs versus what we could see. The updated code is still pretty recent, and we haven't put any incentives in place associated with that, like pre-approved plans or any sort of community marketing or communication that encourages more of that. So I think we need to just be cautious about that aspect.
We may want to do something with that because I do think it is the council's view that we should encourage ADUs, and that was the adoption of the new updated code was just a first step. There were some things we wanted to do, but we didn't have the money to do, honestly, to follow up on.
Well, yeah, I think that, again, to what we were mentioning earlier with Jana's point about these critical areas, it could be applied to ADU potential as well. I mean, as you can see, there's 2,000 parcels here that could accommodate, size-wise, could accommodate a small ADU, 800 square feet or 1,000 square feet. So, the fact that we sort of only added 42 to the capacity, and that is also, by the way, a sort of at least 1.5 times more per year than has been seen recently. So we did try to account for some increased production, although it's a modest increase for sure. But again, we were trying to be conservative from the capacity standpoint, just to understand, where does that leave the city as far as the capacity goes by income band. And maybe we should just get to the end of that so we can, because I think that we could circle back to these numbers forever as we were saying, but just to sort of wrap up the slides here, and so we can have a discussion without being concerned about wrapping up the slides. This shows the sort of grand totals, right? So we have your acreage by zone, density of development by zone. We talked about that. that will give you how many units you can have by zone. And this is that multiple layer thing I was just mentioning. And then we add on top of that ADU and duplex capacity by parcel. So that gives us a total capacity of 946 units. The allocation is 870. So, you know, even with these conservative assumptions, you know, there's enough land to meet the targets. And then on the next slide, looking at where that goes as far as income bands, and just to make clear, this is the crux of this commerce methodology, is that certain income bands are served by certain housing types, as we mentioned at the beginning. So each zone capacity is assigned to an income band based on the types of housing you can develop in that zone and the potential income levels served by that housing type. Now, obviously, multiple housing types, especially multifamily housing, for example, or townhomes, as you were saying, et cetera, can serve a wide range of income, potential incomes. But the idea is to understand if there's the capacity to serve the income, targets by income bracket that were handed down from the county. So anyway, it's pretty close. As you can see, there is capacity in all three, and a lot of that hinges on, of course, the multifamily capacity of the town center and Southern Gateway to serve potentially 0 to 80% AMI. And this is, of course, also a wide range. I mean, the AMI is 145,000, I think, this year. So 80% of that is still over $100,000. And then for your moderate income, you've got the ADUs, the duplexes, the transition zone. So that's mostly where those middle housing types and ADUs, fit into the picture. And then the higher income, of course, in the single family zones. But the targets, the housing need, future housing need in that 80 to 120 and 120 plus categories, as you can see, are quite small. One could also make the argument that, and I think rightfully so, as you were just mentioning, Maddie, that, an ADU, an rental ADU could probably serve a household earning under 80% AMI as well. So there's some flexibility in there, but on the basic level, the capacity for multifamily housing in town center and Southern Gateway at least satisfies the need, at least just barely satisfies the need for the housing target. So
we swear, even though the number is almost precisely 760, that was not intentional.
So the key takeaways, I mean, we've talked about them all, but we just drafted a few, in text form to have in here. Like Forest Park's adequate land capacity, we just said that. Lower income households are predominantly served in the Southern Gateway, with some also in the town center. Duplexes are unlikely to be developed at scale at the moment, based on the market and how much it costs to develop them and what they could sell for or rent for. And then the city's lot sizes provide ample capacity for ADU production, although there's questions about how many ADUs can or would be produced. And that's obviously the place for incentives and programs and code changes around ADUs to really be something we think about when we're looking at goals and policies and moving forward.
And I think instead of just pausing here, I think it's maybe important we get through the next couple slides, because again, this is looking at capacity. When we look at actual production trends, it's a different picture. And I think that's the important discussion and sort of takeaway about where we're going to be going next in this process. So on that note, go ahead, Andrew.
This is the only slide with numbers, although this is a much simpler analysis. But Commerce asks us to look at how many units per year on average are produced in each of these housing types that serve these various income levels, and how many would need to be produced in order to meet the target in 20 years. So as you can see, in the 0 to 80%, so that's basically multifamily housing, on average you're seeing 3 units a year being produced, but the target would be 30 units a year of multifamily housing. So that is where the sort of deficit is. It's not in the capacity to produce them, it's not the land capacity, it's more in the rate of historic production and what would need to change in order to alter that. On the other hand, production of middle housing and single family homes is in excess of that, which would be needed to meet the targets for those housing types and income bands. And so in order to remedy this, I should say remedy, in order to address this, Commerce asks, has a checklist looking at different types of barriers to production. So there's 4 categories: development regulations. So that's code, obviously. Process obstacles is more like permitting and procedural stuff. Limited land availability, so we kind of covered that. Environmental constraints, obviously, and then funding gaps, which is a major one from both the developer side, especially, but also as far as incentives and things go. So this checklist will be something that we're going to be working through over the next few months, and looking at what barriers to production might exist in these 4 categories.
And I think, and it's important to know, you know, a lot of the focus on the numbers around the land capacity that we're looking at previously, some of that could change, and many of the changes we discussed would actually likely increase the numbers of capacity, right? So as far as land capacity is concerned, you know, I think as was sort of assumed at the beginning of this process, your existing zoning, and along with the required changes to allow for a duplex, for example, will supply adequate capacity to sort of meet the requirements of the legislation. But when we actually get down to trying to get that housing built to ensure that there is this diverse mix of housing in the city, that's where the challenge really comes. And I know, you know, looking at historic production is tricky because things will change, the markets will change, but that is, you know, the sort of the preferred methodology of commerce, and also the best way to sort of go about understanding maybe what your future, at least in the near term, what your annual production will be. And so the way that this works is that, you know, we'll go through, you know, saying a checklist, it's certainly not a box checking exercise. It's to be thorough in looking at all of the things within your existing code that need to change to, for one, meet the requirements of the new legislation, but also to understand what are things that could be done within your development code, within your process of permitting and et cetera, that could encourage the types of housing types that you're seeing a deficit in here.
So David, that does concern me, because you know, we have 2 locations where we could get that additional density. Our regulations are pretty standard multifamily regulations. We don't have like special things, except that if you build over a certain magnitude, you must have a certain percentage of affordable housing. And our permitting processes don't have very many obstacles. We're amazingly faster than the city of Seattle, for example. We do have limited land availability, and the funding gaps are, we can't build it because we don't have the money, and no developer has come in interested in building there. So the funding gap is really the private marketplace.
Absolutely.
So it's fine to analyze the barriers, but I don't at the end of it want us to, I don't think that we actually have barriers other than no one has come forward wanting to build at these locations.
Well, there's too much hay to be made. If you have capital, you're gonna go for projects that have the highest return. And right now there aren't enough barriers for that and incentives for accepting a lower return on your investment. I mean, the calculation he did for the duplex.
Yes.
Shows you, of course, if you have a choice of building something where you're gonna clear $100 grand or you're gonna clear $500,000, you're gonna go for a project and clear.
No, that's true. So we are just, and because anyway, I just want to say that the assumption seems to be that we have development regulation and process obstacles. And of course, we do have funding obstacles, because a lot of cities bigger than ours with a commercial base are able to fund their own subsidized affordable housing, and we're not. So all I want to do is express concern that I don't want that to take us to a complete gutting of our regulations. But I do think the affordable requirements in our regulations have been part of the obstacles.
Yeah, and you know, when these things kind of come down from on high, it can seem, you know, to be sort of dispassionate and onerous, and I think that the spirit of I'm always trying to figure out what was the spirit of these new laws and regulations, and what is the spirit of these processes that Commerce is constantly producing these massive guidebooks for us to implement. And I think it's not to necessarily say that there's something that these barriers manifestly exist, or that you put them in place intentionally. I think the idea is just to take a look at it and see what might be happening. Of course, there are things in the market that can't be controlled through any of these four processes.
And the other thing is, we don't want to build buildings in our city that look like what they're building on Lower Lake City, which aren't actually they're gonna be like falling apart in 20 years, I think. The way that construction is occurring and the exteriors look, that's just like junk building. So I don't think our interest is in, not making sure that we have buildings that will stand the test of time for affordability. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox here. I understand what you're saying. We have to go through the hoops.
Do you have more slides, David?
The further slides we have are about next steps, additional considerations. We did want to show, you probably saw this in the packet, how we talked about financial feasibility for a duplex. Not that there is no requirement to allow an additional middle housing type, or any, you're not required to allow, say, a fourplex throughout the city. We wanted to take a look at, just as an exercise, what would that look like from a financial feasibility perspective, both for rental and ownership possibilities. And you can see that, it does change some of the possibilities, just in terms of there would be some additional feasibility in some parts of the city, though not by a huge amount. And this is not to show as sort of a policy direction or a recommendation by any means from our end, but more just, these are some of the things that we could continue to explore with further guidance, and especially with the middle housing grant that was just received. We'll be looking at alternative path compliance around the 75-20% alternative density requirements. But this is also a chance to sort of dig into some of the other potential possibilities around maybe additional middle housing considerations more generally within the city.
David, I just want to point out, I'm not sure I completely understand the purpose of this diagram you have, but you have one of our city parks marked as a place for fourplex.
Oh, yeah. Is that this
and out subsequently, since
the larger one in the north? Yeah.
So can I add one consideration to this? I think that our council would be interested in the idea of a community land trust approach to provide affordable housing, and we might be willing to allow something like townhomes or a cottage. I don't know what the difference. I honestly don't know what cottage housing is, I guess. But some of these options, if it was exclusively for affordable housing, not as part of something like a nonprofit community land trust, that is what resonates with our city. So when you're looking at this, when you consider looking at this additional analysis, that's the lens I think that at least a lot of council members would be looking for. So how can we actually make it affordable? We're not talking about investment returns of 15% for private investors. What if we go the nonprofit way and we have some special provisions that allow these to occur, in a situation where it's a nonprofit developer, but not otherwise.
Can we see, is there anybody online? You guys have been off screen for a while just because of this presentation, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to come in with questions or comments that you may not have been able to provide yet.
I'm just trying to digest all this, so I don't have any questions or comments at this point.
Okay. Anybody else online? Okay. How about in the room?
Well, if we're done with the slides, I just did have something.
Absolutely, jump in, please.
So I have had a thought that is like concerning me, and that is that the Growth Management Act itself has created this problem by, and I first started thinking about this. I don't know if you guys remember we had a group come in and suggested this book, and in it homelessness is a housing problem, and in it contrasted Seattle and the Puget Sound area with Charlotte, North Carolina, and they had actually more growth in the same period of time than we did, but they didn't have any restrictions on development, and so they have a super low, their housing didn't spike in cost, and they also don't have the homelessness problem because they have more affordable housing. And so that just kind of like sparked a little thought, and then I actually found this this Master's in Science dissertation from MIT from a University of Washington grad that it's entitled "The Effects of Washington State Growth Management Act on Housing Development in the Greater Seattle Area." It was published in 2001, and it basically, he was a prophet. I mean, it exactly, predicted that it would be, the housing prices would go because you constrained the development, and so supply and demand, lack of supply with high demand makes high prices. And so you all know, or most of you do, that this is new, this kind of thing is new for me, but this is something that I just thought, like, I think we need as an area to maybe rethink the constraints that we put on building, and that would be a way for more affordable housing to be created that would, have, instead of, when my husband and I first bought our first house, we were low income, and we bought a house on the outskirts of town, and it was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, but people like me aren't able to do that anymore because we're going to put them into these tiny little apartments, and we had 3 kids at that time. So I just think that, anyway, this is a concern that I've had. It's been really, weighing on me a lot, actually, and just throw that out there if there's anybody that thinks the same way, or so maybe I'm missing something, because this is all new to me.
I don't think you're missing anything. I think it's an excellent comment, and I think that, I certainly share that, and as I've dug into some of this as well, it does seem to be by and large a problem of a decreasing diversity of housing types and a real prioritization around profit on housing versus housing as infrastructure. So I think we've steered clear of not, there's been a more monolithic approach to houses. We have very large single family houses. I challenge any of us to point to anywhere in our region that's building smaller single family homes or utilizing a condo approach. We're seeing very large 2,000+ square foot townhomes. We're seeing very large single family homes, and we're seeing very expensive apartments. And that lack of diversity drives, I think, that those big gaps that are being created in our housing market.
Right, but the only place that these would be feasible would, because as we saw tonight, the property costs are so prohibitive here. But if we expanded our urban growth boundaries, that wouldn't be the case anymore, and different housing could be built, and so anyway.
I guess I want to look at not that I disagree, and I want to look at what are the parameters, right? I mean, we're not going to be able to change the growth management, right? I mean, that's something very big that.
Right, I get that, and in this thing, he talks about there's going to come a point where we're going to be forced to build these, what are they, pillar buildings, and that is going to come. We're going to come there because everything that is easily developable is already taken up. And anyway, he really nailed it, I think, and I would like to see us rethink this and say, like, so there's, the yellow in this map is the urban development, and then the light green is rural characteristic residential, and I would like to see us all consider opening up that to the, just regular development. Maybe I'm missing something.
Well, I think one thing that I think one thing that that has come up a lot in the Northwest overall in the past decade or maybe less even is it's sort of like you either have to build out or build up, and so there has been a lot of densification occurring, but I think that the whole middle housing conversation and the new legislation in Washington and also in Oregon that's passed in recent years has sort of been an attempt to fill in that gap and see if we can create more supply just to relieve some of the pressure, the intense housing pressure that we've seen from the market. And this just reminds me of like a recent study. I may have even mentioned it to you in September that was done in Portland after they legalized a lot of middle housing types and have been seeing a lot of things happening, a lot of fourplexes and sixplexes being built. But one thing that that occurred in Portland was that they put a limit on the maximum size of single family units to encourage people to build more duplexes and triplexes and things like that. And so it was like an effort to sort of, well, that's one way that policy can sort of influence this market imbalance that we're finding ourselves in. But for example, in Oregon right now, people are having a lot of these same conversations, and the governor is just introducing bills this year to expand urban growth boundaries and things. So there's a lot of conversations going on, along those lines everywhere. And yeah, it's interesting theoretical stuff to think about.
I would just, I really appreciate your bringing that up, and I really respect where you're coming from. But I think I work in the environmental policy arena, and I actually spent a lot of my time trying to protect the rural areas from getting developed more densely. That's what I do for my job, or part of it. And there are really good reasons to try to concentrate growth in urban areas and to protect rural areas. But I think where the problem lies is, unfortunately, in communities like this one and other ones where there's been such opposition to breaking the single family zoning paradigm that all we've tried to do is, oh, well, let's go to these light industrial, let's redevelop those into big, high multifamily and see if we can fix the problem. It's not going to do it until every city around here takes a serious effort at breaking up what we've grown accustomed to, which is that, well, just don't touch these single family neighborhoods. We're going to have this problem. So to me, the solution, and I'm not saying there's not opportunities for the growth, the UGA and others to expand, there may be, but I think this is much more solvable in our urban areas if we're willing to make some hard decisions. Like, I don't understand why my property is R15. I love it. Don't get me wrong. I love my property. Why can there only be one unit for 15,000 acres when I'm 5 minutes from
15,000.
I'm sorry, 50,000 square feet, when I'm 5 minutes from I-5 and soon to be 5 minutes from Light Rail. It doesn't make any sense. I love it, and nobody's going to force me to do anything with it, but it doesn't make sense to me.
I think you make a valid point. I just want to be careful because I really appreciate everything you've been sharing today, but I think while a lot of us collectively are digesting, what I don't want is to somehow sort of say that that's an assumption that's shared by this whole commission right now, because I think it is more complex than that, and you are bringing an expertise that we don't have. But I personally feel that it's more than that. I think that reduces the complexity of this to something that seems like we're just attached to our trees and our big elbow room, full properties. And I don't think it's that. I think noticed as a community, we've had some great stewards over time who have been really focused on the environmental aspects because they're not seeing good solutions elsewhere. And I'm not so attached personally now to keeping a 15,000 square foot lot. It's that I don't see any models before we disrupt what is working in our town. I want to be sure we have a model that we feel like could work and balances our ability as a community to be climate resilient and have something to hope for later versus just rushing in and degrading our properties, much like I think has been happening in Shoreline in our neighboring cities. So I just want to be careful that we all have a chance to sort of reflect on what we're learning and establish, you know, a more comprehensive understanding of the complexity of the housing market. It's not just NIMBY, it's not just, you know, red line implications. I think it's a real lack of innovation for how we look at housing in our communities. And I think the good news, Andrew and David, thank you so much as we're getting to the end here, for everything you shared today in terms of your methodology. The good news is that it looks like with conservative, very conservative modeling, to Yanni's point, you know, about the what you've done with the critical areas, we can very easily meet the requirements, the legislative requirements that we have as a community, which means we can focus our attention on innovation. And so I would really challenge you both to help us think and learn, you know, learn from other communities, point us if you might to reading materials, so that we can think about housing trusts. I think we can also look at deed restrictions. The housing trusts are just one way for us to achieve that affordability. So, you know, if we can meet our targets, then let's focus on really being an excellent model and neighbor by trying out some things that in fact move the needle on affordability, which is the thing we could do. I don't think we're going to be able to attack the housing crisis in our region. There's too
Well,
many good
and I
minds.
do want to say one thing for clarity. My point was not that this city has this problem that we need to fix. My point was growth management is about the region.
Yeah.
And I believe in Puget Sound, a big part of the problem is how we've dealt with single family. Now, that doesn't mean that we should throw anything out. I'm just saying that is it's not the only piece, but regionally speaking, it's a big driver. And, you know, I think everybody in Puget Sound should acknowledge that and realize that if we're going to move the needle, we need innovation. We also need to question some of the things
we need attractive models, attractive other options.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to that end, I know we are at the end of our time, and you know, as you said, Maddie, that's, you know, we look forward to the challenge. Every community is grappling with this very issue right now, right? This is the important discussion that frankly was the intent of this state legislation, was to sort of bring up these sort of conversations throughout the region. And I think we've heard a lot of good ideas and a lot of good questions from you all today. And now our task is to go back over the next few months and dig into some of these options and strategies, identify some potential other, you know, housing types or tools that can be utilized in Lake Forest Park to address a lot of these issues that you all are discussing today. So, you know, when we come back to you, in March is when we're slated to be returned in front of this commission. That's our task, is to bring forward a lot of good strategies for discussion before we actually begin fleshing out the housing element in earnest.
I think if we can look at it through the lens, like how can we make sure that what gets built has affordability kind of built into it? Because that's what the state legislature hasn't done, is put in any of those kind of provisions. That's why the community land trust is appealing, because it's locked in affordability. So to the extent you know of tools or models that don't involve the city building the housing. Yeah,
problem is it takes a lot of money, right?
that would be helpful, because what's getting built is not affordable anywhere around here.
Lois?
No, I just wanted to add that it'd be interesting to see if the consultants, I know you work with a lot of largely single family residential jurisdictions, but if you, through your lens, could also tell us if within the zoning code, how we could be a little more flexible to allow for innovative things that are going on around the country for, jurisdictions such as ours, to the point of allowing, more innovative designs, or, not being so restrictive in our zoning code such that we are always and I appreciate that we're doing multifamily, we're looking at ADUs. But if there's anything else, I know Maddie, you had previously talked about the village idea, which I thought was so neat.
Cottage
But
clusters.
yeah, just I don't know, time wise, it might be a little too much, but you guys look at all those different, you guys have a view that we don't have, that is looking at and comparing, multiple jurisdictions. But again, from a legislative standpoint, maybe our zoning could be more flexible. I agree. I think this discussion really is kind of our exercise in going through the Growth Management Act, and how this little jurisdiction like Forest Park is a part of that and reflecting on it. And I love that we're having this discussion. But again, if it would be kind of interesting to see if there are innovative zoning policies out there that we're just not seeing. I'd be curious about that. So anyway, thanks.
Thanks, Lois. Melissa?
I just have a quick comment, because I feel like as we're going through all this stuff, and I'm trying to digest it, because I'm hearing all these ideas, and I feel like there's just like all this, like things like pulling in different directions. I mean, earlier this evening, we had somebody come and speak about planting more trees in the area and trying to protect the environment. And then we're talking about like adding density, and then we're talking about like, how do we keep it affordable? And there's just like all these conflicting things that I feel like are fighting against each other. And I think for me personally, when we're working on this, I think that's something that I would like to go through. Like, we can't just be everything to everyone. We cannot be all of these things, is what I'm feeling like. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's one of the things, Christina, you did a nice job reminding us about what we should be reading up on before our meetings. But I think Meredith is, a great example here that, we're all out and about in our communities and travel. When you see things that look good in another community that spark an idea for a model or an option that we might leverage in our own community, take a picture. Jump into some reading material and look at what are some successful models, out there that we might want to reflect on and consider as we're working on the policy piece, mindful that that's not the same as working on code. That'll be the next step. So I think that's important, that we're all looking for examples for solutions that can help us crack those nuts that you've just outlined, Melissa. I'm going to move us along since we're done. It was great and full, and I think that we have. Do we have any new business that you want to report? Status of the position?
Yeah, so we have a new assistant planner,
Yeah.
Elizabeth Talavera. She started on the 1st. Comes with a couple years of experience in this position. So far so good. She hasn't left us yet. We're good. Community development director, we have potentially 3 candidates. We'll be vetting the last 2 this week, and we do some interviews and fill this position. So keep you posted. And tree inventory is going to be coming before the tree board later this month.
Okay.
Well, that's
So we'll
great.
be able to give an update and to the council as well. Planning commission, how that turned out. So that's all I got.
All right, thank you so much. And Sarah, do you have any additional comments? Is there anyone else online, Nick, besides our group?
Do not believe so.
Okay. All right, then I think we should take a motion for adjourning, unless there's any final comments that are just burning a hole in your pocket.
I'd like to make one request
Yes.
for the consultant team, next time you're here, which is that one thing we haven't really talked about in these first two discussions about housing is what HB 1110, the whole, you must allow duplexes or you must allow some of these housing types is also linked to ensuring that they're affordable for 50 years. And we haven't really talked about what does that mean in practice? Like I reread HB 1110 today and I'm like, oh, wait a second. This isn't just about density, it's about density if you make it affordable, and I don't feel like I really understand it. And I think it's really pretty important for us to understand, so I'd love to get a little bit on that next time.
I think they said Commerce was working on that, right? You said that 2 meetings
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah, and I think the affordability bonus for fourplexes is, and not for the tier of cities that Lake Forest Park is in because of population. So I don't think that that's, but that is a provision in there. There's a lot of provisions in there. We could definitely talk about that next time a little bit more. There's also, I mean, if you're really bored and you want to read it, there's a new model code out and a very thorough accompanying guidebook that explains every provision of the model code on the Commerce website, which I have to say is very well written, but incredible. So.
There's a little editing.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would love to take a motion for us to wrap up.
So
Second,
Second.
thanks, Sam. All those in favor, please say aye.
I,
Opposed? And I hope those of you that are sick feel better soon.
Our current code says if you build a 5 nights, 1 unit has to be affordable, I think.